so much. And if I could just say so, it's such an honor to be invited to speak to you to this conference. I've been aware of COV&R for a long time because of Jay. And I've been, kind of marginally aware of the thought of Gerard and of the work of some of you here. But the actually being asked to speak feels a little overwhelming, but I realize it's partly because you have a habit or a custom of inviting a speaker from the host institution, and you have the unusual circumstance of being hosted this year by Regis in Denver. And I want to say on behalf of the university how grateful and happy we are that we could host you. It's been a real pleasure. You're a great group. So, Life at War, the mystical thread in Denise Levertov's political poetry. I would like to begin with kind of an epigraph, a quotation from the German theologian Johann Baptist Metz. In his great book on faith in history and society, he writes, Catholic theology in modernity appears to have been deeply shaped by a profound schism between theological system and religious experience, between doxography and biography, between dogmatic theology and mysticism. What would a theology have to look like that's able to put an end to this schism? In a tentative way, and in order to characterize its aim, I would name a theology of this sort a dogmatic theology that arises out of life's histories, a kind of theological, existential biography. So I begin with 4 preliminary notes. First, although I did not directly reference the conference keywords after truth in my title, the layered meanings of this phrase drew me into my own thinking on this topic in very fruitful ways, and I'm grateful for that. So I'll say more about after truth below. And second, as Jay mentioned, I think of myself as a systematic and fundamental theologian, with the accent probably on the second term, fundamental theologian. My doctoral work on the Salvadoran Jesuit philosopher, theologian Ignacio Ellacuria helped me discover how much my own theological imagination seems to have always gravitated to questions probing the very nature of theological epistemology and language, of talk about God, of questions of what we would call fundamental theology, or if you will, method in theology, or foundational theology, recognizing how unstable all these designations are in our welter of still or postmodern academic cultures. As such, along with Ellacuria and his colleague John Sobrino, I've been deeply influenced by the thought of William F. Lynch, of the German theologian Johann Baptist Metz, who I quoted just a moment ago. Any of these would be worthy interlocutors with René and his thought and with you. But, and this is my third point, as the title of my paper indicates, I've chosen to focus on a poet, Denise Levertov. Over the years, her poems, her journals, letters, critical essays, in many ways, especially her life story, has touched the living fibers of my way of believing as few others have. From my first encounters with her poems, when a friend loaned me 2 of her books, I was in doctoral studies, to my later daily practice of writing or typing out her poems so that I could feel each word in my fingertips, as it were. And as I moved from spiritual reading and prayer into quoting, using Levertov in class lectures, in parish homilies, and later on in academic conference talks, Denise appeared over and over, accompanying me, mentoring and lending support, although she died 20 years ago. She was not the first or the only author whose works I breathed in and treasured, but she stands as the most important and abiding of all these writers, artists, and missionaries, these visionaries who've shaped me. And my fourth note, While I will adduce something of a thesis in these remarks, it's not a huge claim, but it is a claim. I don't intend to develop a rigorous conceptual argument so much as attempt to awaken some felt connections to our human world that spring from the poetic gift of Levertov. Hence, I put some priority on reading several of her poems in their entirety, and I deliberately didn't give you texts of the poems because you would read them instead of hearing them, and poetry is, first of all, music. The words on the page are the score. We wouldn't go to an opera and read the score. We listen to the music. So my opening citation is relevant to the way I'm attempting to approach theology. I will be suggesting in broad strokes, without going into the argument in detail, that the conceptually abridged and condensed narrative of Denise Levertov's life story in God's presence is a story found most powerfully embodied in her poems and is extremely valuable in considering issues related to politics, religion, to faith, and violence. So I structure my remarks now in what I call 4 meditations. And I warn you now, the third of the 4 meditations is the longest. So here's the first meditation. After truth, the supposedly post-factual cultural moment. The brief apologia that Steve McKenna wrote to elucidate our conference theme draws attention to some of the poetic depth and thought-provoking ironies embedded in our conference title, Politics, Religion, and Violence After Truth. Steve writes, after truth immediately suggests the supposedly post-factual cultural moment having particular resonance with recent anxieties over fake news, alternative facts, and other pathologies of the contemporary political sphere, end quote. I'm intrigued by the multiple meanings of the phrase, after truth. Beginning with the supposedly post-factual cultural moment, it seems clear that long before the phrase fake news was a thing, truth and deception in journalism, in philosophy, and the liberal arts, in human life and culture, in business and politics, was a thing. Consider this brief poem by Denise Levertov from one of her latest collections, one of the last of her collected works, a volume called Evening Train, published in 1992. She entitles this poem, Misnomer. They speak of the art of war, but the arts draw their light from the soul's well, and warfare dries up the soul and draws its power from a dark and burning wasteland. When Leonardo set his genius to devising machines of destruction, he was not acting in the service of art. He was suspending the life of art over an abyss, as if one were to hold a living child out of an airplane window at 30,000 feet. It's perhaps fair to think of our current political moment of one that is excessively intense in its various forms of cultural warfare, especially around issues of truth and lies and bullshit in politics. But truth and deception are, and always have been, among other things, crucial theological themes, and their depths are hidden in the Edenic mists of our human origins. And speaking of Eden, in another poem taken from Evening Train, Denise does something very interesting with the story from Genesis 2 and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not strictly a didactic poem, but I enjoy reading it against Enlightenment critiques of religion that regard Genesis as proof that religion is anti-reason. Her delicious title for this poem is Contraband. The tree of knowledge was the tree of reason. That's why the taste of it drove us from Eden. That fruit was meant to be dried and milled to a fine powder for use a pinch at a time, a condiment. God had probably planned to tell us later about this new pleasure, but we stuffed our mouths full of it, gorged on but and if and how, and again, but, knowing no better. It's toxic in large quantities. Fumes swirled in our heads and around us to form a dense cloud that hardened to steel, a wall between us and God, who was paradise. Not that God is unreasonable, but reason in such excess was tyranny and locked us into its own limits, a polished cell reflecting our own faces. God lives on the other side of that mirror. But through the slit where the barrier doesn't quite touch ground, manages still to squeeze in as filtered light, splinters of fire, strain of music heard, then lost, then heard again. Second meditation. Denise Levertov, After Truth Seeking. Steve's initial précis of our conference theme reflects on a curious second way of reading the phrase after truth. And again, I quote him as he says, after truth also indicates the pursuit of truth, and it prompts us to think about where we are and who and whose we become, both when truth is obscured and after it is disclosed. Truth, deception, and indifference to truth are foundational concerns of René Girard's mimetic theory, and the moment is apt to revisit them. Denise Levertov lived in the abyss of Cold War America's creeping political despair. She resisted the tawdry allure of late capitalist consumerism and the globalization of social apathy. She understood with bracing clarity the problematic character of authentic faith in a situation where religious authority appears untrustworthy and religious language arbitrary. For much of her adult life, some 30 years, she lived with what she would later call, and I quote, a regretful skepticism which sought relief in some measure of pantheism, end quote. Often during those years full of doubts, she called herself an agnostic. She even came close at times to the cliffs and falls of despair. Yet she moved through that world of doubts to a place where she could reimagine faith and eventually discover a credible, if fragile, poetic articulation of religious experience. In her, as in other similarly luminous lives, the continuous interaction between life and art cuts a path into new and hitherto hidden fields of meaning. And it's for us to discover and to tap such meaning, to remember her, and to share her light. She was born in 1923 and raised near London and educated entirely at home. Her mother had grown up in Wales, the descendant of a locally famous mystic. Beatrice Levertov was a woman enthralled with nature, steeped in literature and language, and in love with art and music, gifts she passed on to her brilliant daughter. Denise's father was born in Russia to a Hasidic Jewish family whose ancestors included the famous Rabbi Schneur Zalman, the founder of a very important Hasidic group. Paul Philip Levertov became a Christian theologian, and eventually an Anglican priest after reading the New Testament. But as a scholar of Jewish mysticism and a pastor of a small English congregation, he always thought of himself as a Jew who had found the Messiah. Beatrice and Paul met in Istanbul in 1910. They were married and eventually settled in England. When Denise was 16, with the onset of World War II and the bombings of London, she published her first poem, Listening to Distant Guns. Even as her parents made room in their home for 10 Jewish children who were refugees from Nazi Germany. Denise served as a nurse during the later stages of the war, and in 1946, at the age of 23, she published her first book of poems in London, The Double Image. After the war, she married an American writer who had just been discharged from the service, Mitchell Goodman. They moved to the United States, where their only son was born in 1949. And Levertov began, as she puts it, relearning the English language in an American cadence, an American idiom. Her great mentors and friends in this endeavor included poets William Carlos Williams, Robert Creeley, and Robert Duncan. She also began to fashion a new political sensibility in relation to such literary activists as Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, Daniel Berrigan, and Muriel Rickefeller. Between 1956 and 1964, she published 5 new books of poems. She won a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in 1962, and she won recognition as one of the leading American poets of a new generation. It's worth recalling that although she had disaffiliated from the formal practice of religion, her poems from this agnostic phase of her life resonate with profound spiritual depth. Consider this poem, which was published in 1961 in a volume tellingly entitled The Jacob's Ladder. The poem is called The Fountain. Don't say there is no water to solace the dryness at our hearts. I have seen the fountain springing out of the rock wall and you drinking there. And I too, before your eyes, found footholds and climbed to drink the cool water. The woman of that place, shading her eyes, frowned as she watched, but not because she grudged the water, only because she was waiting to see we drank our fill and were refreshed. Don't say there is no water. That fountain is there among its scalloped green and gray stones. It is still there and always there with its quiet song and strange power to spring in us up and out through the rock. Whether we human beings notice it or not, the fountain is still there and always there with its quiet song and strange power. The source of mystery, of music, of depth, of nourishment and solace. It is present even when unnoticed. It was always there in the case of Denise. This is not to deny or to minimize her long swim through the waters of agnosticism, but she did notice the fountain even when she couldn't enter its waters. And while we do detect a shift toward explicit religious loyalties and patterns of behavior in the 1970s and later, this shift only occurred within the larger contours of her entire life and her astounding attention to and integrity with questions of doubt and faith, suffering and mercy, justice and hope and truth. Which brings me to my thesis. So my thesis entails a recapitulation of the point I've just been making, a second observation rooted in her biography, and finally the thesis proper. 3 quick points. First, the recapitulation. The groundwaters of religious faith were close to breaking the surface on numerous occasions in Levertov's life. But it was another 17 or 18 years after writing The Fountain before she returned to the active practice of Christian faith. Second, the biographical observation. Before she did explicitly return to religious faith, Denise turned dramatically and intensely to the world, including the world of politics and violence and impunity. She became one of the great political poets of the 20th century, and along with that, a tireless political activist. And so, my simple thesis: Denise Levertov became a towering spiritual poet that she is because she first encountered the world. Her eventual recovery of the explicit religious lineaments of her poetic vocation resulted in large part from her honest and passionate engagement with such political themes as war, racism, poverty, nuclear proliferation, ecological degradation, in short, with historical suffering in its myriad forms. In her, the mystical and the political intertwined. And in both of these primal elements of the human, she experienced herself as called to a service, as having a vocation to be a poet in the world. So, third meditation. This is the long one. Life at war, the war against war, and a vision. In a 1966 interview on a television program called National Educational TV Presents USA Poetry, I was fortunate to be able to find this online. Denise Levertov spoke of a recent struggle with writer's block. None of us know anything about that, right? Created in part by the felt sense that she, quote, had to write a poem about the Vietnam War, but she couldn't seem to do it, and she couldn't seem to do much else. Here are her own words describing that moment. Quote, I don't have much current work going. I sort of got hung up this winter, feeling I had to write a poem about the war and not being able to do it and being unable to do anything else as a result, until a certain point when I did do a poem that was totally unrelated to anything like that. And writing that one seemed to make it possible to write the one I'd been hung up on all that time. End quote. So I want to look at both of these poems that she refers to. The poem about the war that she felt she had to write and would eventually be named Life at War. It was published in 1967 in a volume entitled The Sorrow Dance, along with an extraordinary elegy to her older sister, several other poems that deal directly with the Vietnam War, written after this one, and the other poem that she refers to here, and which she eventually entitled A Vision. As I read the whole of Life at War, I will also evoke a visual memory through some photographs taken over 50 years ago. She writes, the disasters numb within us, caught in the chest, rolling in the brain like pebbles. The feeling resembles lumps of raw dough weighing down a child's stomach on baking day. Oroka said it. My heart, could I say of it, it overflows with bitterness. But no, as though its contents were simply balled into formless lumps, thus do I carry it about. The same war continues. We have breathed the grits of it in all our lives. Our lungs are pocked with it. The mucous membrane of our dreams coated with it. The imagination filmed over with the gray filth of it. The knowledge that humankind, delicate man, whose flesh responds to a caress, whose eyes are flowers that perceive the stars, whose music excels the music of birds, whose laughter matches the laughter of dogs, whose understanding manifests designs fairer than the spider's most intricate web. still turns without surprise, with mere regret, to the scheduled breaking open of breasts whose milk runs out over the entrails of still alive babies. Transformation of witnessing eyes to pulp fragments. Implosion of skinned penises into carcass gullies. We are humans, men who can make, whose language imagines mercy, loving kindness. We have believed one another mirrored forms of a God we felt as good, who do these acts, who convince ourselves it is necessary. These acts done to our own flesh. Burned human flesh is smelling in Vietnam as I write. Yes, this is the knowledge that jostles for space in our bodies, along with all we go on knowing of joy, of love. Our nerve filaments twitch with its presence day and night. Nothing we say has not the husky phlegm of it in the saying. Nothing we do has the quickness, the sureness, the deep intelligence living at peace would have. Nothing we do has the quickness, the sureness, the deep intelligence living at peace would have. 2 weeks ago, I had cataract surgery on my right eye. It's remarkable how filmed over my eye had become. In fact, I'm kind of struck by how filmed over the good eye now is. I was ready to stop driving. I nearly had a disastrous fall while presiding at Mass at a theological conference last month in Minneapolis. It's strange how we don't really know what we have until it's gone. And then a restoration. I cannot recall a time when I have felt such sustained, spontaneous urges to turn to God in sheer gratitude and say, thank you for my eyes. I can see. And here, I think, is the first lesson of Levertov's life at war. We've taught ourselves not to see. How can we see the truth when we cannot see it all? We've turned savage insanity into normalcy. We make it as invisible as we can. We are cultivating social and spiritual cataracts. And to what disastrous ends? The United States is currently at another war, at war in 2 other new wars, long after Vietnam. We've been at war for 17 years, and for the most part, it's completely forgotten, completely invisible. We don't talk about it. We don't think about it. I don't. But war is never without its effects. Our lungs are pocked with it. The mucous membrane of our dreams coated with it. The imagination filmed over with the gray filth of it. I wonder if Denise would ask us to ponder the extent to which this will not to see, this will to forget human suffering, is the source of the cataract filming over our civic and political discourse. I wonder. But Denise speaks of a second poem. At the time of the interview she gave on National Educational Television, she hadn't even yet titled it. The version she read there is slightly different from the final version she published in The Sorrow Dance, which I will read. She says in the interview that this was not a dream. It was sort of a waking vision. She eventually entitled it A Vision. And, as she often does in her poems, she prefaced this one with an epigraph that comes from Spinoza, as quoted by Ezra Pound. The epigraph reads, The intellectual love of a thing is the understanding of its perfections. Here's the poem, A Vision. Two angels among the throng of angels paused in the upward abyss, facing angel to angel. Blue and green glowed the wing feathers of one angel. From red to gold, the sheen of the others. These two, so far as angels may dispute, were poised on the brink of dispute, brink of fall from angelic stature. For these tall ones, angels whose wingspan encompasses entire earthly villages, whose heads, if their feet touched earth, would top pines or redwoods, live by their vision's harmony, which sees at one glance the dark and the light of the moon. These two hovered, gazed before one another, for one saw the sea-feathered, peacock-breakered crests of the other angel's magnificence, different from his own, and the other's eyes flickered with vision of flame petalings, cream gold grain feather glitterings, the wings of his fellow, and both in immortal danger of dwindling, of dropping into the remote forms of lesser being. But as these angels, the only halted ones among the many who passed and repassed, trod air as swimmers tread water, each gazing on the angelic wings of the other, the intelligence proper to great angels flew into their wings. The intelligence called intellectual love, which, understanding the perfections of scarlet, leapt up among the blues and greens, strong-shafted, and among amber down, illumined the sapphire bloom, so that each angel was iridescent with the strange, newly seen hues he watched. And their discovering pause and the speech, their silent interchange of perfection never became a shrinking to opposites. And they remained free in the heavenly realm, in the heavenly chasm, remained angels, but dreaming angels, each imbued with the mysteries of the other. Before I offer a few of my own thoughts on this poem, I want to quote the comment Denise made in that 1966 interview just after reading both of the poems, Life at War and A Vision. She observed, "I feel that I've only just begun to have some understanding of what the angel poem is about, and not enough understanding to want to talk about it, because it was a mystery to me. I hadn't been thinking about angels. The vision of angels appeared, as far as my consciousness was concerned, out of nowhere. And it seemed at the time of writing quite unrelated to anything I had consciously in mind. Since they were written very close to one another, and since the one did seem to pave the way for the other to be written, I presume there is actually some underlying relation between them. But I don't feel that I understand what it was. The angel poem is a mediumistic kind of poem, and the war poem is a poem that expresses what I know, I think, and feel." End quote. I must say I'm no expert in the discourse around mediumistic poetry, or for that matter, the discourse on mimetic theory. So I'm going to depend on you to help me get this right. But it seems to me that the angel poem, A Vision, pitches the crisis of mimetic rivalry brilliantly. However, in the vision, the potential rivals do not give in to violence. Something happens. She intuits that it might correspond to what Spinoza and many ancient and medieval theologians before him called intellectual love, or more properly, the intellectual love of God. I keep wanting to point out in bold letters, all of this is happening. She receives and writes about this vision in the heart of her agnostic years. Denise intuits, if that's the right word, or rather she was given a vision that I dare say touches near the heart of the mimetic drama and the drama of grace. What is so striking about this? It is this vision, what I should call it, the integration of mimetic desire into something greater, a greater desire. Does that make sense? I don't know. But a second crucial point also has occurred to me. It's the one she makes. The vision of the angels unblocked her. It opened a way for her to enter the heart of mimetic darkness, the violence of war, and to speak. It enabled her to write a poem she felt she had to write, her words, but couldn't until this vision was given her. Now, this was just the beginning, and she had a long trek through the human valley of the Vietnam War and the war against the war before she herself could begin to embody as a human the intellectual love her angelic mentors modeled. In the years after she wrote Life at War, a dam broke in her. She not only wrote a mountain of poems warring against the war, but she and her husband, Mitchell Goodman, threw themselves physically into the anti-war movement with a ferocity that scared her friends and at times left her exhausted and drained. Her husband, Mitch, was tried and convicted of conspiracy to break the law requiring young men to register for the draft. Do you remember the famous Boston Five? Along with Benjamin Spock and William Sloane Kaufman, Mitch Goodman was one of the five. And for her part, Denise lived through those wild times, writing powerful political poems, at times on the brink of fall into the mimetic chaos. And I must confess, I found some of her poems from volumes like Relearning the Alphabet in 1970, To Stay Alive, remarkable volume, 1971, The Freeing of the Dust, 1975. I found some of those poems deeply disturbing. I haven't liked them. But I've discovered over and over how the poetic vocation itself drew her back from the brink. A grace, a muse, an angel stayed with her. Time doesn't allow me to go into this further, and to tell you the truth, I have a lot more pondering to do about these years of her political blossoming. But the honest turn to the political, as I aver in my simple thesis, empowered her later full turn to the religious. And so with that, I turn to my fourth and final meditation on being. As the Vietnam War slogged to its painful conclusion, at a time in her life following the death of her mother, at the age of 93, and the breakup of her marriage, Denise found herself in a season of solitude, stillness, and grief, a time of learning to breathe again, a time between what was, what had been home, and what was to come next, a time of passage. She was standing at a threshold, about to enter a new stage in her life and her poetry. She never did abandon her commitment to political action or her passion for those who suffer in history. But almost without realizing it, she began also to reawaken to the possibilities of Christian hope in the practice of political solidarity and peace work, and in liturgical practice. It didn't happen overnight. There was no singular, startling interruption. Rather, after long, tiring bouts wrestling with spiritual questions and theological perplexities, the The image of Jacob wrestling with the angel was among her favorite motifs. She gradually, almost inchoately, began once again, as she says, breathing the water of Christian faith and practice. As she tells it, she virtually wrote herself into faith. One of the early poems written from this new place in her life appeared in her volume, Oblique Prayers, 1984. She entitles this poem, On Being. I know this happiness is provisional. The looming presences, great suffering, great fear, withdraw only into peripheral vision. But ineluctable, this shimmering of wind in the blue leaves, this flood of silence widening the lake of sky, this need to dance, this need to kneel, this mystery. Here, I think it might be helpful for you to see how she scores this poem. You'll notice it's 13 lines long. It includes 2 commas, 2 dashes, 6 colons, and no periods. It's a lot of colon. This meditation is provisional, expectant. The very grammatical form of the poem seems to drive language to the outermost boundaries of experience, beyond which lies only this mystery. In this anticipatory mood, she touches something essential regarding spirituality, refining the content of such words as faith and doubt. Here, in this poignant sigh of a poem, Denise sets out from the experience that cannot be explained, an experience that is open-ended yet unavoidable, an experience that leads to thought rather than channeling previous thoughts, definitions, or formula. It is the inscape of human impulse, this need to dance, this need to kneel, that appears almost as a hologram of the inscape of all reality, this mystery. The genius of her faith buds from her profound attention to and appreciation of this connection. For all the spiritual beauty of this poem, what is most striking is its insistence on the material reality of our world. The shimmering of wind in the blue leaves, the flood of stillness widening the lake of sky, the human need to dance, the act of dancing, the need to kneel and the implied gesture of kneeling. Neither this poem nor any of the truest of our religious impulses allows faith to deny matter, to deny the earth, or to deny the body, or our discontents, or our disappointments. Just so, the looming presences, great suffering, great fear, remain within the experience of faith. The irony of faith does not reject suffering or ridicule fear. It does not shy away from doubt, nor does it aim to transcend by leaving life's troubles, but by entering them. Far from a denial of death and its analogs, the need to dance and the need to kneel emerge from the heart of a mature human living that ironically encounters suffering. These are characteristic gestures of human depth. The spiritual and the earthly are utterly and completely intertwined. This then gives dramatic weight to the enigmatic adjective at the heart of the poem, ineluctable. It takes a bold poet to hang a whole poem on an adjective. The word appears after Levertov has already passed the first two colons, the fact of her unexpected and provisional happiness, and the fact that great suffering and great fear are indeed looming presences in and throughout all of life. Now she gestures towards something more. The shimmering of the wind, the flood of silence, and the correlative felt need to celebrate and to worship remain unavoidable, inescapable, inexorable. Standard synonyms for ineluctable, which nevertheless fail to capture a key connotation detected in her adjective and verified in its etymology: the element of struggle. It is in the reality of our lives that we encounter spirit-filled joy. Our happiness, however provisional, gives rise to the inescapable sense of this mystery present in all that we touch. And among all the lessons Denise teaches regarding faith, that it involves struggle, that it requires us to enter fully into what William Lynch calls the valley of the human, is this great lesson that comes to light when we attend to a further irony in this poem. Although Denise clearly seems to draw on the fruits of spiritual experience in writing it, and although it explicitly echoes her religious and theological transformation, the title of the poem, On Being, resonates overtly with the history of Western philosophy. It calls to mind a key word in the vocabularies of some of our greatest thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, and Aquinas, for example, and in such works written during Levertov's life as Heidegger's Being in Time and Sartre's Being in Nothingness. It is significant that the poem's title gestures towards philosophy, because philosophy begins from the reality of this world and our knowing encounters with the world. And that is the point. Levertov's acute, poetic, call them phenomenological observations from the brink of her colons cannot be dismissed as something beyond public discourse. The experience of mystery is not restricted to some group of spiritual insiders, some esoteric cult. Anyone can verify in her or his own experience a desire to respond to beauty, a need to address suffering and limitation. And although On Being is not intended as a philosophical or transcendental meditation per se, it does lodge within the ambit of reason, of philosophical reason, an act of witness, an act of faith, one that she intrinsically reconnects with the essential biblical witness. There's one final lesson bequeathed by this brilliant dance kneel imagery. Just as Levertov seamlessly crosses what often seems an unbridgeable chasm between the investigations of philosophy and the discourses of religion or theology, so too she bridges the terrible split between the religious traditions connected to Jesus. Most poignantly, the split between Christian and Jew. The joint heritage that ran through her family. She does not choose between them. Both her Christian piety, this need to kneel, and the distinctive worship of the Hasidic Jew, this need to dance, usher into the presence of what lies between and beyond her penultimate and final colons, this mystery. Levertov's religious struggle did not end, but actually intensified as she moved ever more profoundly into the practice of Christian faith. She became a Catholic towards the end of her life. She made the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius and discovered she had been writing poetry her whole life, using imagination precisely the way Ignatius urges. She just never realized that was prayer. Troubled above all by the violence of religious exclusivism, she struggled until the end of her life to voice her own theological intuition that the fullness of life with God implies that all will be one. Without tackling that issue here, but simply by gesturing toward the need to kneel and the need to dance, she hints that the mystery implicates and invites everyone. So let me conclude by giving the final word to Denise with one last brief poem, a companion poem to On Being. Another, I like to call it, sigh of a poem, attempting to describe what really can't be described, the dawn of genuine faith in God. She calls this poem, quoting St. Paul in King James English, that passeth all understanding. An awe so quiet, I don't know where it began. A gratitude had begun to sing in me. Was there some moment dividing song from no song? When does dewfall begin? When does night fold its arms over our hearts to cherish them? When is daybreak? Thank you.